the final recommendations that came out of the plan, there are a lot of them, but one specifically related to the 3rd Street Bridge is action RT2. And to paraphrase it here just a little bit for sake of space, is essentially was to construct a multimodal full access bridge on 3rd Street at Paradise Creek. It would include traffic calming measures and bicycle facility enhancements on 3rd Street from the 3rd Street Bridge to Jefferson Street, so pretty much the entire corridor, including, and these are really examples, traffic circles, curb extensions, chicanes, neck downs, really what they're thinking traffic calming features in that short list. It also went on to say that that traffic calming should extend east of Mountain View when the current street end is constructed into its full street connection. And keeping in mind, 3rd Street will eventually head east from Mountain View and swing around to the north all the way up to towards Mountain View Park. And that the final proposed traffic calming features and their location will be determined by future design and community outreach process. So that was really the first point in the plan where they said we are recommending that there should be traffic calming on the corridor. We don't know yet what that traffic calming will be, and that there should be a process later to figure that out. Well, I think we're now to that point with the council's inclusion of the bridge within the 2018 budget, then we're starting down the road of actually developing a project. And something to keep in mind here, there has been some concern expressed in the community about why don't we know what the traffic calming measures are, or why don't we know specifically what the design of the project is going to be. The reason for that is up until yesterday, beginning of the fiscal year, we did not have a project, right? We had a concept that had been discussed, significant amounts of time, but we did not actually have a project. So the city was working on other things, many other projects going on. Now that the city council has approved a budget that includes funding for a bridge, we now have a project. So now we will begin this process of figuring out what these things are actually going to look like in a detailed design effort. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit about how that will happen here in a few minutes. One other item that came out of the transportation plan was the traffic model. And the idea with traffic modeling is to really take a look at what do we project traffic volumes will be under different scenarios looking out into the future. In this case, the multimodal plan looked at the target year of 2035, which was in excess of 20 years at that time. And they were trying to project through a computer model simulation with anticipated growth within the community of a certain amount of population, university growth with student population, and general traffic patterns and proposed changes in the traffic system, so new street extensions or connections that didn't exist at the time being installed. What would we see in 2035? So they ran some different scenarios to look at that, but they also had a specific section pertaining to the 3rd Street Bridge because they knew that was a question that folks were concerned about, what would happen. So the model is, as most models are, it is an estimation of what volumes you could anticipate seeing based upon the assumptions that are put into the model. Assumptions like how fast do we grow and what choices people take for roads and modes of transportation. So this information reflects what that model predicted for 2035 on the 3rd Street corridor. Starting on the left-hand side, you see here at City Hall, so just right outside the building here, the model anticipated that the growth of traffic without a bridge, really no changes in the system on 3rd Street, would change from what it was in 2012 at that time, which I believe was around 7,000, up to about 7,800 vehicles per day. So that was the projected growth just in volume of users in the system. Okay? And then if a multimodal bridge was installed with traffic calming included along the corridor, that the projected volume would be about 7,700 vehicles. In the grand scheme of things, 100 vehicles up or down in a model projecting 20 years out, it's essentially saying very little change between a bridge or no bridge at that point on 3rd Street. Now, as you move to the east, as one would expect, you'll start to see greater changes between having a bridge or no bridge because the choices that people make as they traverse that corridor heading to their home or wherever else they're going. So between Buren and Van Polk, that's a good one, Van Buren and Polk Streets, the no bridge option, they're seeing a prediction of 5,800 vehicles a day, and then with the bridge, with traffic calming, possibly a little reduction down to about 5,500 vehicles.
5,835.
5,800 in 2035.
Correct.
These are all 2035
you said today,
numbers. Per day, yeah. 5,800 vehicles per day in the year 2035 versus maybe 5,500 vehicles per day in the year 2035. Again, continuing further east between Garfield and Blaine, this is where you start getting past Hayes and where a lot of people currently turn north or south because they use other alternative routes. It's where you start to see the more significant changes between bridge or no bridge. So the model predicted about 1,300 vehicles a day between Garfield and Blaine without a bridge and about 2,800 vehicles a day with a bridge. So there is a change there. Okay? And then as you expect, as you go on to Mountain View, the numbers keep getting a little smaller. Without a bridge, there's really just one block there of Mountain View, or excuse me, of 3rd Street west of Mountain View, so 50 vehicles a day for those few houses versus about 1,800 vehicles a day if a bridge was constructed. One thing to keep in mind here is these numbers, 2,800 and 1,800, while they are modeled as a fairly good size change, when you talk 1,300, 2,800, 2,800 vehicles a day, 1,800 vehicles a day is not that uncommon, certainly for collector streets, but even for local streets. I mean, these numbers are not that drastic when you look at the street system within the community. Okay? But thing to keep in mind here is what we're really looking at is what kind of changes could occur based upon the model's projections. It also then took a look at D Street. So D Street at Van Buren, without a bridge, roughly 6,600 projected. With a bridge, 7,400. And you see an increase here. Well, most likely that increase is primarily associated with overall system growth in the community. Okay? The volumes are just going up over that 20 years everywhere. And then between Garfield and Hayes, 6,200 vehicles a day, and then potentially a little bit of a decrease if the bridge goes in, because some of those folks that would otherwise turn on Hayes perhaps would stay on 3rd Street, and therefore the traffic on D on the east end would go down a bit. 6th Street, similar type of situation at Harris Street, roughly 6,700 vehicles a day. With the multimodal bridge, about 7,400. So we're still seeing growth. Part of this is probably also due to the fact that there's some assumption that the traffic calming on the corridor will entice some people to take a different route than 3rd Street. And so you would see some folks use 6th Street anyway, right? Even though the bridge is there. And then as you go on to the east, 5,800 without a bridge, dropping to perhaps 4,300 with a bridge. So most of the changes in the traffic patterns really are occurring on the east end of the corridor. What happens really around the high school here and this area near downtown, because we're already seeing the majority of the traffic volumes traversing from downtown to the east at that point, really is not anticipated to change drastically other than just general growth. As you move further east, of course, the people are making choices about where they're going to drive. Then you start seeing some changes on the east end of the corridor. So that's what the model predicted way out in 2035. Okay, another item that has come up in some of the discussions has been, and we've heard it here at the council, has been, has the city changed the speed limits on 3rd Street over the last number of years? So we've gone back and done some research, and what we found was in about 1974, there was a citywide traffic study performed by the Public Works Department, and recommendations of that study were presented to the City Council that addressed traffic speed limits, or really street speed limits, throughout the community. Interestingly enough, they recommended the base speed limit be set at 30 miles per hour. And for all of you who drive in the city, you know it's 25. That's because the City Council said, no, we think 30 is too much, and the City Council dropped it to 25 as the base speed limit throughout the community. And that was done through an ordinance that you see there in December of 1974. But that ordinance also specifically addressed a couple of arterial and collector streets, 3rd Street being among them. It set 3rd Street speed limits from Washington to Van Buren at 25 miles per hour, from Van Buren to Hayes at 30 miles per hour, and from Hayes to the end of 3rd Street at 25. Interestingly enough, these are exactly the same speed limits that they are today. And in our research, it does not appear that they have ever changed in that time since 1974. So it looks like we've stuck with that original set of rules set by the council in 1974. Fort Russell Historic District is out in the east part of the city. Most of you are familiar with this. There's been some discussion about whether or not the corridor passes through the district or in some manner affect the district. So this is a map of the district as it currently exists, and what you can see in red here is the boundary that's been in place for quite a few years. 3rd Street on the map is just right down there. So it's about a block south of the southernmost edge of the district as it exists today. And I phrase it that way because there is a proposal that's out there at the federal government level now to increase the size of the district. So this is the proposed new boundary, and presuming that the folks back in D.C. approved the change, this is what the new district boundary would become. And 3rd Street now, as you can see, is right there on the very southern edge. So the district would border 3rd Street on the north edge of the 3rd Street right-of-way. So the another way to put that is 3rd Street would be adjacent to the district, but would not pass through the district. Street classifications, we've talked a little bit about this. The Transportation Commission has addressed this quite a bit as it relates to 3rd Street and the corridor and other streets within the community. The Urban Area and Functional Classification Map I mentioned earlier was actually approved in 2003. It has a title on it of 2010 map. It did designate 3rd Street from Washington to Mountain View as an existing collector arterial. You say existing because it was saying that's a road that's existing. That map also includes future extensions or future collector arterials, and it was shown as extending east of Mountain View as a future collector arterial on the 2010 map. The 2014 update, as I mentioned earlier, that went through Transportation Commission, recommended a change of 3rd Street classification to minor arterial between Washington and Mountain View, and the Transportation Commission did support that change. And the multimodal plan, when it was adopted by City Council, did also include the recommendation that the 3rd Street corridor be classified as a minor arterial. When it comes to the practical application of the classifications within the city of Moscow, there are not significant differences overall. Okay? And just to step back for a moment, minor arterials are typically addressed as or defined as roadways that gather multiple collectors, multiple neighborhoods, and pass through a community from one side to another, whereas collectors tend to be serving individual neighborhoods on a little bit smaller scale and can still pass through significant portions of the community. When it comes to the city standards, this chart represents what we would require for new streets that are constructed in the collector arterial or minor arterial categories. So the right-of-way width, the minimum width that we would accept in a new section of street would be 70 feet for collector and 90 feet for minor arterial. The street width itself is the same, 34 feet. Sidewalks, there are 6 feet wide for residential areas for minor arterials, or 8 feet wide for industrial commercial areas, minor arterials, as compared to 5 foot wide for collector streets. Number of vehicle lanes is 2 in both cases, and bike lanes are required on both at 5 feet. So in practice, in terms of what a street looks like when you're building new streets, physically there's not a lot of difference here. And there's a difference in the right-of-way width, which is property ownership, and then the sidewalk is wider on the minor arterial. Other than that, the street sections remain the same. When it comes to existing streets, we do not, I guess, put into practice an approach where we would say, hey, we have to take this existing street and somehow modify it and expand it to meet whatever the current standard is. What we do is we take a look at what is the existing street, what is the existing right-of-way, is the street complete or not, and then try to complete those streets in a manner that's consistent with what does exist there. So I know there's been some discussion about if 3rd Street was classified one way or the other, that somehow the existing street would have to be changed. And that has not been the practice of the city of Moscow. And again, the adopted standards for these different classifications, as you see here, they're not significantly different on the ground anyway.